A toddler in a Hadza camp in northern Tanzania has just been weaned off breast milk, and she cannot feed herself. The tuber that will keep her fed through the dry season is buried under packed earth that takes an adult's full body weight to break loose. Her hands are too small for the job, and her arms are too weak. Her mother is nursing a new baby and cannot spend all day out in the bush hauling two children along. So somebody else does the digging. Somebody who stopped having children of her own years, sometimes decades, earlier. Her grandmother, a chimpanzee, once weaned, mostly solves this problem on its own. It can pick its own fruit, strip its own leaves, forage well enough within a year or two of leaving the breast to survive without a parent doing the work for it. A human child cannot. Weaning happens early in humans compared to other apes, often well before age 3, and yet full self-sufficiency at finding food doesn't arrive for another decade or more after that. Somewhere between infancy and genuine independence sits a long, expensive stretch of childhood in which a human is neither nursing nor able to feed itself, a gap that doesn't really exist in the same form anywhere else among the great apes. Somebody has to cover that gap, year after year, child after child. That single fact, an older woman who can no longer reproduce spending her days digging food for a child that isn't hers to nurse, sits underneath one of the strangest puzzles in human biology. Human females routinely live for decades after their bodies stop producing eggs. Almost no other mammal on Earth does this. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, don't. Gorillas don't. Elephants, despite living into their 60s and 70s, keep reproducing for most of that time. A wild female chimpanzee who survives well past her fertile years is the exception, not the rule, and when it happens, she is usually frail, marginal, and close to death anyway. So why does the human female body shut down reproduction while leaving, on average, decades of otherwise healthy life still ahead of it? For a long time, the explanation people reached for was medicine. The assumption was that menopause followed by decades of life is a modern invention, a side effect of vaccines and antibiotics, and clean water keeping women alive, far past what nature ever intended. It's a tidy story. It's also wrong. Menopause shows up at roughly the same age across cultures with wildly different diets, healthcare access, and life expectancy, from industrial Finland to hunter-gatherer camps in Tanzania. It isn't a symptom of living longer, it's a schedule, and something wrote that schedule into the human body a very long time before hospitals existed. The explanation researchers eventually landed on wasn't really about mothers at all. It was about grandmothers, and it changed how anthropologists think about why humans turned into the particular kind of animal we are. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Most people assume something simple when they think about aging in the ancient world. That women died before menopause ever mattered. That a body wearing out at 40 or 50 in a harsh environment made the whole question academic. There's some truth buried in that. Life in the deep past was dangerous, and average life expectancy at birth was low, pulled down hard by the staggering number of infants and children who never reached adulthood. But average life expectancy at birth is a misleading number. It counts every infant who died in the first year alongside every adult who lived into their 60s, and it drags the whole figure down without telling you much about what an adult who survived childhood could actually expect. Once a woman made it to adulthood in most documented traditional societies, she had a real chance of living another 3 or 4 decades. Anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado, who spent years building detailed life tables for the Ache people of Paraguay, and later comparing them against records from the Kung of the Kalahari and the Hiwi of Venezuela, found the same pattern showing up across all of them. An Ache woman who survived to age 15 could, on average, expect to live into her 60s. That is not a population where old age was rare or accidental. It was a normal, expected outcome for anyone who cleared childhood. The dying young explanation doesn't hold up. It doesn't explain why a body would stop reproducing decades before death instead of simply reproducing until death, the way almost every other female mammal does. Something else was going on, and the first real clue came from an animal that isn't human at all. Menopause, in the strict biological sense, meaning a long, healthy, and predictable stretch of life after reproduction ends, is one of the rarest traits in the natural world. Outside our own species, it shows up reliably in only a small handful of toothed whales, orcas, narwhals, belugas, and short-finned pilot whales among them. That's essentially the entire list. Not primates. Elephant matriarchs are often held up as the obvious counterexample, the wise old female everyone already pictures. But elephant matriarchs keep reproducing for nearly all of their long lives. Their wisdom and their fertility run side by side, right up until the end, which makes them a poor match for what's actually being asked here. Not lions, not wolves, not any of the animals people usually picture when they imagine a wise old female leading her family. For decades, this made menopause look less like an adaptation and more like a glitch, something that happened when reproductive systems simply ran out of eggs faster than the rest of the body wore out. But a glitch should show up unpredictably, scattered across unrelated species with no particular pattern. Instead, it kept appearing in species that share a very specific social structure: long-lived females who stay embedded in tight family groups built around mothers, daughters, and grandchildren for their entire lives. That pattern was the clue. Whatever was happening looked like a strategy built by selection, the same as any other trait in the body. And to understand why, you have to go to Tanzania, and to one particular anthropologist who spent years crouched in the dirt watching old women dig. Kristen Hawkes, an anthropologist at the University of Utah, began fieldwork with the Hadza in the 1980s, working alongside James O'Connell and Nicholas Blurton Jones. The Hadza are among the last populations on Earth who still live largely by hunting and foraging, in the Eyasi Basin of northern Tanzania, and Hawkes went there to study foraging behavior in something close to its ancestral context. What she noticed wasn't in her original research plan. She kept watching the oldest women in camp head out every single day, digging deep into the ground for the same tough, fibrous, calorie-rich tubers that toddlers were too weak to extract on their own. Young children could pick berries themselves once they were mobile. They could not dig a tuber out of dry season earth. That gap between what a weaned child could feed itself and what a weaned child actually needed to survive was the opening Hawkes had been missing. She started tracking it methodically, measuring how a child's growth and nutritional status tracked against who was providing for them. As long as a mother had only one dependent child, the mother's own foraging explained the child's growth. But the moment a new baby arrived, and the mother's labor shifted toward the infant, the older child's growth stopped tracking with the mother and started tracking with something else entirely: how much the grandmother was digging that week. In camp after camp, the presence of an actively foraging older woman was doing measurable, trackable work, keeping a weaned, still helpless child alive and growing. In Hawkes's original sample, only about half of the older women filling this role turned out to be biological grandmothers in the strictest sense. Some were great-aunts, some were more distant kin. The role mattered more than the exact bloodline, but the underlying labor was the same: an older, post-reproductive woman, digging every day, feeding a child that wasn't hers to nurse, so that her daughter could go have another baby sooner. That last part is the piece that turns an act of kindness into an engine of evolution. A grandmother who frees her daughter from full provisioning duty isn't just keeping one grandchild alive. She's shortening the time between her daughter's pregnancies, which means more grandchildren, more copies of the grandmother's own genes moving into the next generation, purchased not through her own fertility, but through someone else's. Hawkes later extended the same fieldwork approach to the ache in the forests of eastern Paraguay, a very different environment from the dry, open savanna of the Eyasi Basin, and found the pattern held up there too, even though the specific foods and terrain had almost nothing in common. That mattered. A single group living in a single ecosystem could always be an accident of local circumstance, shaped by one particular landscape or one particular set of crops nobody else on Earth relies on. Two unrelated foraging populations, on two different continents, separated by an ocean and thousands of years of independent history, showing the same reliance on older, non-reproducing women for a specific and identifiable slice of the food supply, looked much more like something evolution had actually built. If a hunch built from watching one group of foragers in one river valley in Tanzania sounds too thin to explain something as fundamental as human menopause, that's a fair instinct, which is exactly why the next piece of evidence didn't come from the Hadza at all. It came from parish record books in Finland, some of them over 300 years old. In 2004, a team led by Mirka Lahdempere at the University of Turku, working with Virpi Lumma and colleagues, published a study in the journal Nature built on an almost absurdly detailed source: the birth, marriage, and death registers kept by the Lutheran Church in Finland going back to the 17th century, cross-checked against similar church and population records from farming communities in Quebec, Canada, during the 18th and 19th centuries. These were pre-industrial populations, living hard agricultural lives with high child mortality, decades before modern medicine, which made them an unusually good proxy for the conditions humans evolved under. The team tracked thousands of women across generations and asked a simple question with a very large data set. Did having a living grandmother actually change anything for a child's odds of survival? It did, and the effect was not small. Children with a maternal grandmother still alive and living nearby after weaning had a meaningfully better chance of surviving to adulthood than children whose grandmother had already died. Mothers with a surviving mother of their own also tended to have shorter gaps between births, exactly the pattern Hawkes had predicted from watching tubers get dug up an ocean away and more than a century later. Every additional decade, a grandmother lived past menopause, translated, on average, into additional surviving grandchildren. It was the clearest demographic evidence to date that menopause wasn't a biological accident. It was, in a very literal genetic sense, paying for itself. Biologists have a term for animals that raise offspring with regular help from individuals other than the parents: cooperative breeders. Meerkats do it, certain marmosets do it, naked mole rats, wolves, and a handful of bird species do it. Humans are, among the great apes, the only cooperative breeders. Every other ape species raises its young almost entirely on the mother's own labor, with little routine help from anyone else. Humans broke from that pattern at some point, and grandmothers appear to have been one of the earliest and most consistent sources of that outside help, predating fathers' involvement in some models, predating organized group hunting in others. Once you're looking for cooperative breeding instead of just parenting, the whole shape of human family life starts to look less like a nuclear unit and more like a small, coordinated workforce. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The tidy version of this story runs into trouble at this point, because grandmothering is not automatically good, and not all grandmothers produce the same effect. A follow-up analysis of that same Finnish data, published in 2019 by Simon Chapman, Jenny Pete, Virpi Lumma, and Mirka Lahdempere in the journal Current Biology, went back and asked a sharper question. Was there a point where a grandmother's presence stopped helping and started costing? The answer was yes. Grandmothers past roughly 75, or in declining health, provided measurably less benefit, and in some households, when multiple young women were raising children in the same crowded household at the same time, the benefit of an extra grandmother could shrink toward nothing, or even reverse, as everyone competed for the same limited food and attention. Grandmothering wasn't a switch that flipped on at menopause and stayed on forever. It was a resource with real limits, shaped by health, by household crowding, and by how many other caregivers were already stretched thin. There's a second complication that researchers studying kinship networks kept running into, one that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with certainty. A maternal grandmother, a mother's mother, always knows with total certainty that the grandchild in front of her carries her genes. A paternal grandmother, a father's mother, is relying on the assumption that her son is the biological father, an assumption that across human history has not always been safe to make. Studies comparing maternal and paternal grandmothering across dozens of societies with very different family and residence patterns, consistently find that maternal grandmothers invest more and produce a stronger measurable effect on grandchild survival than paternal grandmothers do. Paternal grandmothers care just as much, in most cases. The underlying genetic math beneath that care is simply different, and evolution, blind and indifferent as it is, tends to favor investment that is genetically guaranteed over investment that is merely probable. Anthropologists working in agricultural societies with strong patrilineal traditions, where a young wife moves into her husband's family home and lives under the authority of her mother-in-law, have documented cases where an older woman's presence actually correlates with worse outcomes for her daughter-in-law's children. The two women are, in a sense, competing for the same household resources and the same claim over the children's labor and loyalty, and a mother-in-law's incentives don't line up neatly with a daughter-in-law's the way a mother's incentives line up with her own daughter's. Kinship, it turns out, is not a single universal force. It runs at different strengths down different lines, and grandmothering is strongest exactly where the genetic stakes and the social incentives both point in the same direction. None of this fits neatly into a single, universal image of the wise elder automatically strengthening every family she touches. Grandmothering is powerful. It is also conditional, competitive, and unevenly distributed, which is a far messier and honestly, far more human picture than the folk version of this idea usually allows for. So the behavioral case for grandmothering is strong, even with its complications. But behavior doesn't fossilize. Digging sticks rot. Shared meals leave no trace. If grandmothering really did reshape human evolution, there should be a mark left somewhere harder to argue with than modern observation, something written directly into old bones and teeth. In 2004, that evidence arrived, from a source nobody expected, the wear patterns on ancient teeth. Rachel Kaspari, at the University of Michigan, working with Sang-Hee Lee, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that asked a deceptively simple question. Across the long span of human evolution, how many adults actually lived to be old, compared to how many died relatively young? Kaspari and Lee couldn't carbon date their way to an exact age for every skeleton, so they used something more reliable across huge stretches of time: the degree of wear on adult molars, which accumulates at a fairly predictable rate as a person chews food across a lifetime. By comparing older, more heavily worn adult teeth against younger, less worn adult teeth across 4 successive periods of hominin evolution, spanning Australopithecines through early Homo, through Neanderthals, and finally into early modern humans of the Upper Paleolithic roughly 30,000 years ago, they could calculate a ratio of older adults to younger adults in each population, and track how that ratio changed over time. The ratio crept upward gradually across most of that span. Then, in the Upper Paleolithic sample, it didn't creep. It jumped, more than 4-fold higher than in the Neanderthal populations that had lived in many of the same regions not long before. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, an adult who reached what we'd now call late middle age was a genuine rarity, a demographic outlier, someone whose presence in a group was unusual enough to be worth remarking on. Then, sometime around 30 to 40,000 years ago, older adults suddenly became common, in a way the fossil record had never shown before, common enough that a growing child in that period would very plausibly have had a living grandmother somewhere nearby for most of their early life. That timing is not a coincidence anyone studying this era can ignore. It lines up almost exactly with the Upper Paleolithic explosion in Europe. Cave art, at sites like Chauvet and Lascaux, elaborate toolkits, long-distance trade in shell beads and ochre, the first clear evidence of complex transmitted culture passed carefully from one generation to the next. Grandmothers, in the strict demographic sense, meaning a population where a meaningful number of women routinely lived long past their childbearing years, may be a startlingly recent addition to the human story, not 2 million years old, possibly closer to 30 or 40,000, which raises the hardest version of this question. If living long past menopause only became common that recently, what was happening before in the hardest environments our ancestors ever faced. Ice Age Europe, 20 to 30,000 years ago, was not a forgiving place to be old. Winters stretched brutally long. Calories were scarce and unevenly distributed across the seasons. Every mouth that couldn't hunt or gather for itself was, in the coldest, hungriest stretches, a genuine cost the group had to absorb. This is exactly the environment where the case for grandmothering should be hardest to make, and it's exactly the environment where, according to Kaspari and Lee's data, older adults were becoming more common than ever before. That pattern makes sense only if old age had become valuable enough, through stored knowledge, through labor, through exactly the kind of provisioning Hawkes documented among the Hadza, that keeping elders alive was worth the cost even when resources were tightest. There's a strange, useful parallel here, and it doesn't come from another human population. It comes from killer whales. Since 1976, the Center for Whale Research has tracked a population of orcas living off the Pacific coast of Washington State and British Columbia, in extraordinary, individual-by-individual detail, following the same matriarchal family groups across decades. Female orcas, like human females, stop reproducing decades before they die, and researchers led by Darren Croft at the University of Exeter and Dan Franks at the University of York used this long-running dataset to ask exactly the question Hawkes had asked about the Hadza. What do post-reproductive females actually contribute? The answer, published in the journal Current Biology, was leadership. Older, post-menopausal females were consistently the ones guiding their pods to salmon foraging grounds, drawing on decades of accumulated knowledge about where food would be when it was hardest to find, and their leadership became sharply more pronounced in years when salmon were scarce, exactly the seasons when a wrong decision could cost the group dearly. A younger, still reproducing female is splitting her energy and attention between her own calf and everything else. A grandmother who has stopped reproducing has nothing pulling her focus away from the group's survival as a whole. Nursing a calf costs a female orca roughly 40% more food than she'd otherwise need, which means every reproducing female is, in a very real sense, in competition with her own daughters for the same limited fish. Stepping out of that competition, permanently, and becoming pure knowledge and leadership instead, turns out to be a strategy evolution has landed on more than once, independently, in two species separated by tens of millions of years of evolutionary distance, in two very different oceans of hardship. A later analysis by Croft's team, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, added a darker footnote to that finding. Adult male orcas that stay close to their mothers for life, which most of them do, face a sharply higher risk of death themselves in the years following their mother's death, even though a grown male is easily capable of feeding himself. The knowledge and the coordination the mother once provided don't transfer cleanly once she's gone. It's a striking reminder that what a grandmother, or a grandmother orca, provides isn't just extra calories in the short term. It's a kind of accumulated expertise that the rest of the group has come to depend on, and that leaves a real, measurable hole when it disappears. None of this means every old woman in an Ice Age camp mattered the same way, or that grandmothering explains the whole of human survival on its own. It's one piece, sitting alongside fire, alongside cooperative hunting, alongside language, in a larger architecture of survival, but it may be a piece that unlocked several of the others, because a reliable, dedicated older provisioner buys a group something beyond just extra calories. It buys time. Human childhood is absurdly long compared to almost any other primate. A chimpanzee is largely self-sufficient within a few years of weaning. A human child remains a calorie sink, dependent on adults for food, protection, and instruction, for well over a decade. That long stretch of dependency is expensive, and it's also exactly the window in which humans learn almost everything that makes us distinctly human. Language, social rules, tool-making, the accumulated knowledge of an entire culture passed down person to person. A species can only afford that long, expensive apprenticeship if someone is subsidizing the cost, and grandmothers, freeing up mothers to have children sooner while directly provisioning children too old to nurse but too young to feed themselves, may be exactly the subsidy that made a longer, richer childhood affordable in the first place. Bigger brains needed more time to develop. More time needed more calories to fund it. Grandmothers helped supply those calories, and more surviving, well-fed children, raised long enough to actually absorb everything an older generation had to teach them, is how a species accumulates culture instead of simply repeating the same behaviors generation after generation without ever building on what came before. There's a further piece to this that some researchers, including Hawkes herself in later work, have pushed even further. If grandmothering extended female lifespan and longer-lived women meant more older, still capable men in the population at any given time, that shift may have altered the balance of competition among males for mates as well, favoring men willing to form a lasting bond with one woman over men chasing shorter, more competitive reproductive strategies. The evidence for that particular extension is thinner and more contested than the core grandmothering data, and it's presented here as a live hypothesis rather than settled fact. But it points at something worth sitting with. A single shift in how long older women lived may have rippled outward into mate choice, pair bonding, and family structure, reshaping far more of human social life than just who was minding the children that afternoon. You can still see the shape of that arrangement today, even though almost nothing about modern life resembles a Hadza camp or an Ice Age winter. Grandparents worldwide remain among the most consistent providers of unpaid childcare on the planet, across cultures that share almost no other similarities, from apartment buildings in Seoul to farming villages in rural Kenya. That's not sentiment repeating itself by accident, generation after generation, for no reason. It's an old, tested strategy, still running quietly in the background of family life, largely unnoticed, doing the same fundamental job it has done for tens of thousands of years. The single strangest fact in this entire story is also the simplest one to say out loud. Out of the roughly 6,000 mammal species alive on Earth today, human females and the females of a small handful of whales are essentially the only ones who reliably live for decades after their bodies stop being able to reproduce. And the fossil evidence suggests that trait, at least in the demographically visible sense of large numbers of women actually reaching old age, might be barely older than cave painting itself. Somewhere in the last several tens of thousands of years, a small number of women started living long enough, healthy enough, to spend that extra time digging tubers, carrying children, leading their families to food nobody younger could locate, and teaching a lot of dependent, slow-growing children everything they needed to know to survive. That decision, made by biology and reinforced by culture over and over across an almost unimaginable number of individual lives, may be one of the reasons there was enough time, enough food, and enough accumulated knowledge for a species with such a slow, expensive childhood to make it this far at all. It kept happening, generation after generation, because it worked, quietly and without ceremony, in thousands of small daily acts of digging and carrying and feeding that nobody at the time would have called history in the making. Every grandmother digging a tuber for a grandchild who couldn't dig it herself was, without knowing it, running one of the oldest experiments our species ever conducted. The results are still coming in church registers, in worn molars, in the pods of whales off a cold Pacific coast, and in every kitchen where an older relative is, right now, feeding a child who is not quite old enough to feed themselves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.